Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Underworld with Christina, a show that descends, transforms, and rises again. The Underworld with Christina is a guided journey into the chthonic realms, a space where ancient stories, forgotten deities, and deep archetypes come alive. Each episode focuses on a different underworld or chthonic figure, force, or concept, exploring their mythology, symbolism, and presence in modern spiritual practice. After exploring the entity or theme, the show shifts into practice. Depending on the episode, the viewer may experience spell work inspired by the deity or concept, ritual designed to help connect with the underworld current, guided journeys that invite personal insight, shadow work, or transformation. The show The Underworld frames the underworld not as a place of fear, but as a source of wisdom, rebirth, and magic. It's a space for seekers, witches, myth lovers, and anyone drawn to the deeper layers of the spiritual world. I am Christina Wilkie Burbach, and I am a spiritual transpersonal psychologist, a high priestess, ordained minister, anthropologist, death witch, death doula, death walker, psychopomp, psychic, modern mystic, occultist, cemeterian, and I work full time in the death care industry. My specialty is obviously working with the dead, and I am also the author of the book Gardens for Ghosts: The Art, Magic, and Ritual of Planting for the Dead. Tonight, we're going to explore funeral rites in Greek, Celtic, and Norse mythology. And then I will cover some ways we can adapt these rites into modern funerals. So, death is a journey that every single human takes. Like, I see it every single day. It's also, I think, one of the biggest stigmas we have is death, and something that's very taboo, and a lot of people don't like to talk about. But every single person dies. So, it's a journey we all will take, and no two cultures imagine it the same way. Tonight, we're going to descend on three ancient worlds, and then I'll cover additional mythologies and worldviews in upcoming episodes. But tonight, I wanted to focus on my three main paradigms and pantheons that I practice: Greek, Celtic, and Norse mythology. And as we descend into these three ancient worlds tonight, each with its own map of the afterlife and its own rituals to guide the dead safely there. From the shadow banks of the river Styx to the mist covered hills of the Celtic otherworld to the burning pyres and ship burials of the North. This is the Underworld with Christina, and tonight we explore the funeral rites that shaped the ancient imagination and the gods who guarded the gates of death. So let's start a little bit talking about Greek funerals. So to the ancient Greeks, death was not an ending, it was a transition, but it was also dangerous because a soul that was not properly buried, so a body that was not properly buried, risked wandering the earth forever. So burial rites and funeral rites, that's a weird word, funeral rites were very important to the Greeks, to the ancient Greeks. And then archaeology shows us that Greek funerary practices dated back to the Mycenaean area. We had burials in pits or chamber tombs. They had grave goods like weapons, jewelry, and pottery buried with them. And then the Greeks showed some of the earliest forms of ancestor veneration. By the classical period, funerals had become a moral and religious duty. To deny burial to someone was to deny them their afterlife. The Greek, as we have already explored in the psychopomp episode, the Greek underworld was ruled by Hades, who was very stern but very fair, and his realm was guarded by Charon, the ferryman, Cerberus, the three-headed hound, Thanatos, he's the personification of a peaceful death, and Hermes, the psychopomp or the guide of souls. Each deity played a role in the soul's journey, and each influenced the rituals performed by the living. So, Greek funerals unfolded in three stages. The first stage was protheus, which was the laying out. The body was washed, anointed, and dressed. Women of the household led the mourning, and then there was wailing and singing and ritual lamination. Then there was the second stage of a Greek funeral, which was ekphora, which is the procession. The deceased was carried through the streets at dawn. There were torches and mourners and musicians. And then there was a final farewell before burial or cremation. And then there was the third stage of a Greek funeral, which was the interment and then offerings. So the deceased was buried or cremated depending on the era. And then they were had grave goods buried with them, like pottery, weapons, and jewelry. There were libations of wine, oil, and honey. And then they were given the obol or a coin for Charon, the ferryman, to take them over his boat, on his boat over to Styx, so he could cross over to Hades. And without that coin, he could not cross the river Styx, and that soul, he or she, would wander up and down the shores of the river Styx for 100 years, as a shade, as a wandering soul, as a lost spirit, as an earthbound spirit. So the Greek afterlife wasn't one place, it was many. As we've talked about previously, it was Elysium, which was for the heroes and the blessed, is the Asphodel Meadows for ordinary souls, and then there's Tartarus, a deep abyss for the wicked. So funeral rites ensured the soul reached its proper destination, and then the soul didn't return to trouble the living. So, I mean, we can see some of those elements in modern funerals nowadays with like a procession. Like I said, I work professionally in death care full time, and many times funerals have a procession from the church or from the funeral home to the place of burial to the cemetery. So a lot of Greek funeral rites, like the washing of the body, especially those of you that are death doulas, part of being a death doula or a hospice nurse or working in death care is washing the body. So there are definitely elements of Greek funerals that we still incorporate into modern day funerals. And then Celtic funeral rites, the Celts left no written mythology of their own. They were a verbal, spoken word. Their mythology, what we know about them, was written down by other people who observed them. So, since they have no written mythology left behind, we understand what we know about the Celts from other people and what was passed down over the ages. So, archaeology and also later texts written by others reveal a culture deeply connected to death, ancestors, and the other world. Celtic funerary traditions varied across regions, but they had common themes: monumental burial mounds, cremation and inhumation, grave goods for continued existence, and a belief in reincarnation. The deities of death in the other world in Celtic tradition. So the Celtic other world, there was no section of the other world that was a place of punishment. It was a parallel realm, lush, eternal, and inhabited by gods and ancestors. Some key figures in the Celtic mythology of death in the other world is the Morrigan. She's a goddess of fate, battle, and death. Arwen, ruler of the Anwen in Welsh tradition, which is other world. The Dawn, sometimes called the Dark One, or a Lord of Death. And then Manannán mac Lir, who is a guardian of the boundaries between the worlds. So Celtic funeral traditions and rituals were very diverse. Every tribe, every Celtic tribe kind of had a different tradition, but they had several patterns and several commonalities. That they buried their deceased in burial mounds and passage tombs like Newgrange, North, uh, there were a number of different passage tombs and burial mounds. And, if you ever have the opportunity, I did that in 2023. I went to Ireland, Scotland, and England, and I visited different burial mounds and passage tombs, and it is just amazing. And then last year, 2024 and 2025, I went to Norway and Iceland and Denmark to explore, cemeteries and their ancient burial grounds. And then my plan is next year to go to Greece and Italy. So definitely, I think it's really cool to go to the ancient world and explore their different like cemeteries and burial mounds and places where they buried the dead. There's so much history over there. Very cool. So the Celtic burial mounds and passage tombs are among the most enduring symbols of ancient European culture, reflecting deep spiritual beliefs, social organization, and craftsmanship. The Celtic burial practices flourished from the Iron Age onward, and they were tied to a belief in the afterlife in the other world. Once again, a realm free from suffering, a parallel world to ours that was very lush and beautiful, very much like the Wiccan or the pagan Summerland. Burials were sacred acts that honored the dead, maintained ancestral connections, and reinforced tribal identity. The placement and design of mounds and tombs often marked individuals of high status or important communal events. There's a couple different types of Celtic burial mounds. There's chambered tombs, which were large stone or timber roof chambers, sometimes communal and used for extended families or tribes. There were passage tombs, which were large mounds with a narrow stone passage leading to one or more chambers. Those are incredible. Definitely go check them out. And then there's other megalithic types like portal dolmens, wedge tombs, and court cairns found in Ireland and other Celtic regions. And cairns are like just piles of stones everywhere. And up in the Highlands over by Inverness in Scotland was some of the most amazing passage tombs I've ever seen. There was a stone circle, and it was called clavicairns. There's a stone circle, like a mini Stonehenge, and then there was, I believe, cairns in all 4 directions. They're just massive. It's so like, just such amazing experience. The passage tombs are a hallmark of Neolithic and early Celtic monumental architecture. They consisted of a mound of either earth or stone with a passage of large stones to essential or multiple different chambers. Many are aligned astronomically with this winter solstice to summer solstice. For example, Newgrange is aligned to the winter solstice sunrise, and these tombs may have served both burial and ceremonial purposes, such as acting as a temple or also a ritual center. They were made of curbstones with megalithic art, large megaliths. Some had cruciform, like cross-shaped chambers. Other have multiple subchambers. They were built most of the time, like the Hill of Tara. They were built on different hills for visibility, and that indicated their importance in the landscape. So there's a lot of very notable examples in Ireland and Scotland. So definitely if you ever have the chance. And then they also, like the Greeks, had ritual offerings in the tombs, like weapons, jewelry, food, and other goods believed to aid the deceased in the afterlife. Offerings and ceremonies reflected a worldview where the soul's journey was supported by material and spiritual provisions. And then these monuments are not only archaeological treasures, but also they're cultural heritage sites, drawing on both historical and mythological significance. They continue to inspire study, preservation, and tourism, offering insights into the spiritual and social life of ancient Celtic societies. Their grave goods also had swords and shields and torques in them, and they had feasting gear like cauldrons and drinking horns. And then some of the burial sites had chariots for high status individuals. They did. Cremation actually, surprisingly, was very common in the early Iron Age, and then later shifted to inhumation or internment, so burying the full body with elaborate grave goods. So I think that's so interesting that cremation came first with the Celts, and then later full body burials. And then their ritual feasting was food offerings for the dead and communal meals to honor ancestors. And food offerings to the dead is something, different witchcraft and pagan traditions practice, especially around Samhain and the Day of the Dead. So to the Celts, death was a doorway, not an ending. The other world was a place of beauty, music, and eternal youth. And funeral rites assured the dead crossed the threshold with dignity and strength. And now Norse funeral rites. So the Norse world was shaped by harsh landscapes and constant conflict. The Norse world is located up in the frozen tundra, up by the Arctic Circle. So very difficult landscape, very difficult weather. And their funerary rites reflected a culture that honored bravery, ancestry, and the power of fire. Like I said, I was up in Norway in October of last year, so about 8 months ago. And there are certain places above the Arctic Circle, like Svalbard, Norway, where no one can be buried because the ground is frozen solid all the time. So you cannot die in Svalbard, Norway. So we got to keep that in mind, the way that they buried their dead. So the deities of death in the Norse afterlife, Valhalla was ruled by Odin, Folkvangar was ruled by Freya, Hel was ruled by the goddess Hel, Loki's daughter, and the burial mounds were where our ancestors dwelled. And each destination required different rites, and each reflected the manner of death. So, like the Celts just had the other world, but The Norse, different realms of the afterlife are similar to the Greeks, different realms of the afterlife. So where your soul was going to go shaped the different funeral traditions and funeral rites that you received. So remember, frozen world, not so easy to do a ground burial in the Norse world. So we had ship burials where bodies were placed, like your traditional Viking funeral. Bodies were placed on boats or stone ship settings. They were filled with weapons, tools, animals, and treasure, and that symbolized the soul's voyage to the next world. So they were buried in their ships. We also had cremation pyres. So fire released the soul, smoke carried it to the gods, and pyres often accompanied chanting, drumming, and offerings. And then when they were able to bury in the ground, grave goods often were swords, shields, spears. Women were buried with keys, jewelry, and household tools. And then children were buried with toys and amulets. So most traditional Viking burials or Norse burials were ship burials or cremation pyres, just because the ground was so frozen all the time. And then to prevent the restless dead, the North, the North, the Norse very much feared the restless dead, very much like the Greeks did. Like if you didn't have a proper burial, you were, doomed to wander the earth, your soul forever and ever. So, very same concept in Norse mythology. They call them draugr, which was the undead beings. So, to prevent that, they had rituals which included binding limbs and placing needles in clothing or burying the bodies with protective runes. So for the Norse, death was a continuation of identity. A warrior remained a warrior, a farmer remained a farmer, and funeral rites ensured the dead reached the realm that matched their life and that they didn't return to haunt the living. So, across Greece and Celtic lands and the Norse world, funeral rites revealed a shared truth. Human beings have always sought to guide their dead and to protect their living, whether through coins for a ferryman, feasts for ancestors, or ships set ablaze on the sea. These rituals reflect our deepest hopes and fears about what lies beyond. So I have a modern fusion funeral rite inspired by Greek, Celtic, and Norse tradition. So this is a way that we can blend, some of you are high priestesses and ordained reverends and do perform funerals, or, home funerals are becoming a thing, and memorials are becoming a thing. So I wanted to provide for you a modern fusion funeral combining Celtic, Greece, and Norse traditions. So each culture kind of has a distinct spiritual lens, but we're going to kind of blend it all together. So the Greek influences the soul's journey to the afterlife, ritual purification, offerings to guide the dead, symbolic fare for the ferryman. The Celtic influence is the other world as a place of peace, ancestral connections, nature based symbolism like trees, stones, and water, ritual feasting, and storytelling. And then our Norse influence is going to be honoring our identity. Look, our identity is our identity, whether we're living or dead, we keep our identity and the deeds that we did. Fire is transformational, and grave goods represent our life and protection rights to ensure a peaceful rest. So together, we're going to blend all this together to create a mythic, grounded, emotionally resistant, and resonant funeral. So the ceremony here is going to blend all three traditions. So we're going to start with a gathering, which is symbolistic of the Greek and Celtic culture. So we're going to gather outside if possible, near water, trees, or a stone circle. And the symbolism in that is the Greeks honored the journey, the Celts honored the land. So you would have the guests enter in silence. A bowl of water infused with rosemary or lavender is placed at the entrance. Each guest would dip their finger in the water and touch their forehead or their heart, which is a Greek purification gesture with Celtic herbal symbolism. And then the next step in the funeral will be a circle of ancestors, which is very much tapping into Celtic mythology. A circle is formed around the casket or the urn. A candle is lit for every major stage of the person's life. A stone is placed in the center, representing the Celtic portal to the other world. Family members speak the names of ancestors who have passed, welcoming them in to be present for the funeral, and welcoming them to help guide the newly departed. This creates community. The dead do not leave family. They join the family in unseen half. And then the third part of the funeral will be the telling of deeds, which taps into North funeral rites. So this is a modern version of the Viking mini, which is a memorial ritual. Friends and family would share stories of courage, humor, love, and struggle. A symbolic honor cup of mead, wine, or non-alcoholic, alternative is passed around, and each person raises the cup and says, "We remember." And this honors the Norse belief that a person lives as long as their deeds are spoken. So as long as their memory is goes on and on, we never disappear. And then the fourth part of the funeral will be the offerings, and this taps into Greek and Norse mythology. A table is set with symbolic items. So we have Greek offerings like a coin placed beside the urn or the casket, which would represent Sharon's fair. Olive oil or wine is poured into a small bowl. A white cloth or flower representing purity or passage is placed on next to the casket or the urn. And then we have Norse offerings, a personal item representing the deceased identity, a rune stone for protection, and a candle or small flame representing a pyre. And then we have Celtic offerings, herbs like sage, yarrow, rosemary, a small loaf of bread or fruit for the journey, and a written blessing placed under a stone. And the guests approach and place offerings one by one. And then the fifth part of the ceremony of the funeral is the blessing of the four realms. We have a blessing, a blended invocation from the east, air, which represents the Greek god Hermes. So he guides the soul on the journey. Then we would invoke south, which is fire, or the Norse pyre, standing for transformation, that cleanses and illuminates the path. Then we would invoke west, water. For Greece, that is the river Styx. For Celts, their sacred wells, and that carries the soul safely to the next world. And then we would invoke the north, the earth, the Celtic ancestors, and the Norse mound dwellers. And that the North receives the body and holds it in peace. And this ritual creates a ritual map of the afterlife that feels ancient yet universal. And then the final farewell is a moment of silence. A bell is rung 3 times. The candle is extinguished, or a flame is released into water, and the officiant says, "May your journey be safe, your rest be peaceful, and your memory eternal." And then the last part of the funeral is the Feast of Remembrance, which really taps into that Celtic and Norse funeral rites. After the ceremony, a communal meal is held. Celtic influences can include sharing food with the dead and the living, storytelling, music, and poetry. And then Norse influence would include toasts to the dead, a seat left empty at the table for their spirit. And this transforms grief into connection, a celebration of life rather than an ending. So, what this modern rite, blending Celtic and Greek and Norse mythology and funeral rites all together, honors the soul's journey, which is a part of the Greek tradition, strengthens ancestral bonds, a part of the Celtic tradition, celebrates identity and deeds, all the wonderful, beautiful things you did in life, which is Norse mythology, and then uses nature, fire, water, and symbolism. It feels ancient yet accessible, and it works for any spiritual background. It's a funeral that doesn't just mourn, it mythologizes the person's life. I also have 2 things yet before I end. I want to just go over a blended Greek, Celtic, Norse funeral blessing, and then end with an essential oil blend. So, my blessing for a combination blended Greek, Celtic, Norse funeral blessing. May the veil between the worlds soften, and may the path before you open with gentleness. May Hermes Psychopomp walk at your side, guiding your steps with steady hands as you cross from this life into the next. May the Morgan watch over your passage, not as a harbinger of fear, but as a guardian of destiny, ensuring your spirit finds its rightful place in the quiet lands beyond the horizon. May the ancestors of your blood and the ancestors of your spirit rise to meet you, as the Celts believed they would, with warmth, with memory, with welcome. May the winds of the north carry your strength, the fires of the south bear your transformation, and the waters of the west cleanse your sorrow, and the earth of the east cradle your rest. May the runes of protection be upon you, as the Norse once prayed, so no shadow troubles your journey, and no weight follows you into the halls of peace. May you find the meadows of asphodel if you seek quiet, the shining fields of Elysium if you seek joy, the green hills of the other world if you seek renewal, or the warm halls of your ancestors if you seek home. May your memory remain a blessing among us, a story we carry, a light we tend, a thread woven into our lives. Go with honor, go with love, go with peace. Your journey continues, and we release you to it with open hearts. And then I just want to end with an essential oil blessing or an essential oil that you can create for. I'll give you a couple different suggestions. So, this is a tri blend. I call it a tri-realm passage oil, which is a modern funeral and an ancient ancestral ritual oil. This oil can bless the departed. You can use it to anoint the body, anoint ritual tools, consecrate space, support grief and remembrance. So the themes for Greek are purification, safe passage, divine guidance. For Celtic, ancestral connection, the other world and natural cycles. The Norse, protection, honor, and the soul's journey. So choose a base oil like olive oil from, for Greek to symbolize purity, blessing, divine favor. You can choose hazelnut oil for Celtic wisdom, connection to the other world, sunflower oil, which is Norse solar strength and continuity. So you can choose all three or whichever one resonates with you based on the tradition you're called to. And then the essential oils. There's 6 essential oils from the Greek mythology, Greek funeral rites, rosemary, 3 drops, remembrance, purification, clarity. We got myrrh, 2 drops for funeral tradition, sacred transition. And then our Celtic elements are yarrow, 2 drops for protection, healing, and ancestral pathways. Cedarwood, 3 drops for grounding and connection to sacred groves. And then Norse elements, we had juniper, 2 drops for warding, cleansing, and safe passage. And then pine, 2 drops for strength, endurance, and honoring the dead. And then there's a couple additional things you can add. You can add a small piece of amethyst, which is a Greek mourning stone. You can add a tiny oak leaf or acorn for Celtic strength and rebirth. Or you can add a fragment of birch bark for Norse new beginnings. So pour the base oil, add all the essential oils one by one for clarity and safe passage, for connection and remembrance, for protection and strength, and then seal the bottle and, warm it by rolling it between your hands. And as you roll the bottle and shake it and blend it, say 3 lands, 3 paths, 1 journey. May this oil bless the living and honor the dead. And then let the oil rest for 24 hours before use. And you can use this oil in a funeral or memorial rite by anointing funeral candles, anointing your hands, anointing the urn or casket, anointing stones or anointing offerings, or for just personal grief support. So I want to just end here with the consecration for the oil. So this blended Celtic, Greek, Norse consecration, oil of passage, oil of peace, oil born of earth and leaf and ancient memory. I awaken you now. By the clarity of Greece, where rosemary grows in the sun and myrrh carries the prayers of the living, may you open the way before the wandering soul. By the wisdom of the Celts, keepers of stone and star and sacred well, may you bind the living to the dead with threads of love that do not break. By the strength of the Norse who honor the fallen with fire and story, may you shield the spirit on its journey and guide the hearts of those who remain. 3 lands, 3 paths, 1 blessing. As oil meets skin, as scent meets breath, as memory meets the quiet places of the heart, may peace descend. May this oil guide the departed with gentleness and honor. May it comfort the living with courage and remembrance. May it sanctify the space between worlds. I consecrate this oil in love, in respect, in stillness. May it carry the blessings of the old ways into the hands of the present. So mote it be. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the ancient underworlds and different funeral rites in the Celtic and Greek and Norse mythologies. Until next time, I am Christina Wilkie Burbach, and this has been the Underworld.